Hello, I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director at 1014. It is my great pleasure, also on behalf of Steve Sokol and the American Council on Germany, to welcome you to the 8th conversation in our mutual series of online discussions under the heading Democracies Under Pressure, Challenges for the Global Liberal Order. In recent years, we have seen internal and external challenges to democracy. With a pandemic, a war, and an energy crisis still ongoing or unfolding, the social and economic impacts of these multiple crises are being felt across the globe. So we have two experts here today from both sides of the Atlantic who can explain how these serious disruptions play out on the economy and society as a whole, in Germany and the US, but also in other parts of the world. Dr. Jutta Allmendinger is president of the Berlin Social Science Center and professor of educational sociology and labor market research at Humboldt University. And Dr. Adam Tooze is a historian and professor at Columbia University, director of the European Institute at Columbia, and non-resident scholar at Carnegie Europe. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Herzlich willkommen. We will also post more information about them into the chat, because if I would continue to do that, we would spend the entire hour talking about our two experts, renowned experts. Today, the conversation will be moderated by Ines Pohl, Washington Bureau Chief for Deutsche Welle. Thank you so much, Ines, for being here today as well. And with that, I gladly hand over to you to start the conversation. Thank you so much.
Katja, thank you so much for these kind words of introduction. I think we're going to have a very interesting 60 minutes or so. And I also want to encourage our viewers, please post your questions, your remarks into our chat room. Jutta, I'd like to start with you. This year's coming to an end. What a year. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how Germany looked like pretty much 1 year ago.
Well, I think actually that Germany looked worse 1 year ago, which may be a surprising answer. Adam is already sort of shaking his head, but a year ago I was working in a very high-level commission which was asked to evaluate the infection protection law, and we were working in a really, really hostile environment, split between people who were the Corona-Leugner, so negating that there's something like Corona, and those who wanted to have more protection. In a society which did not trust in politics anymore, neither in science, in a society with a lot of protest marches, and so it was even hard to work, in this elfenbein or ivory tower of science. It was indeed hard. And then, surprisingly, for many Germans, not for all, but for many Germans, the war in the Ukraine started, and the attention was suddenly at a very, very different point, very different. And German society, in a way, sort of forgot the cleavages they were in. At least, the protest marches decreased. We got considerably less, hostile mails, and this I can say for the politicians as well. It's like when something pops up outside the country itself internally moves more together. And this is what we realized in sciences. We also saw it in increasing trust into sciences, increasing trust into politics. It took Germany quite some while to respond. I myself think very highly that there were not immediate measures, but then this Zeitenwende arrived, and then we were sort of submerged in one measure after the other taken by the German government to protect people in need, to care about the energy poverty and things like this. It probably is another issue whether this entirely was successful. I don't think it was. And then a new process started, and this was that the Greens had to change their program altogether. So move away, you know, from all their milestones in terms of saving the climate, but now doing the best for protecting the German citizens, which is in a way opens the floor for many to well, stand behind the government more than they did before, I think. This does not show in numbers. So when people in Germany are asked whether or not they like the present government, they are very reserved about it. But in terms of how this country feels now, how few protesters we have on the streets, it seems to be calm. Probably to end up with something which concerns me a lot is that many things which were on the agenda of the coalition weren't started at all because of the war, because of the decreasing budget. And there is something which is really like a re-traditionalization, as I called it, for women. And this is not ending. It's also ongoing for people in a vulnerable health state because we still have huge problems in our health security system. But this
okay, I stop you here, Jutta, for the moment. As always, Jutta Allmendinger always comes with a surprise. Adam, do you agree that at least Germany is in a better spot now at the end of this year than in the beginning? And maybe you can also give us a little bit of a take on the United States. But first, is Germany, do you agree with Jutta that Germany is in a better place than it was like 11 months ago?
Yeah, I was smiling in appreciation at Jutta's ability to deliver that smiling move, not in opposition. I do think I would see things slightly differently. Because I take Jutta's analysis to be driven by an assessment of you, like perhaps, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something like the health of the political culture, or
exactly,
or, you know, something like that.
The and internal political culture.
Yeah, so let's use that as one metric. I think if you put two other sort of points alongside that, you could say it's been a year of massive challenge for what many people think of as the German model, if you like, of geopolitical positioning.
Absolutely.
And I think you'd have to say that perhaps, as it were, one could link this in the sense that I think Germany is having what the Brits might call quite an adult conversation about that. So in a sense, I would agree with you, Jutta, that though this is a huge challenge, the Zeitenwende concept has provided a useful spur to quite a serious-minded conversation about Germany's geopolitical positioning. So one could, as it were, one could make the spagat from your diagnosis to this other diagnosis of challenge. From an economic point of view, more narrowly conceived, and let me go there because that's like, a kind of point of strength for me, I think the situation is a bit bleaker, but I would then again converge with you, Jutta, in that it's particularly challenging for those at the bottom end of the German social hierarchy, the bottom end indeed of the European hierarchy as a whole, because we are living through a social crisis. I mean, the Brits call it a cost of living crisis. In Germany, it tends to be coded more as an inflation or as an energy crisis, but whichever way you describe it, what we're really talking about is some very, very serious real income losses. And the welfare state is desperately trying to compensate for these. And it's a huge challenge. And we haven't yet seen the full implications of that because this is a long-term thing. The damage will be done over a period of months, quarters, indeed over years. And we haven't yet faced the downturn in the global economy, which I think is coming next year. We haven't yet faced the recession, which all of the indicators, perhaps not as darkly as they were flashing this bad news a couple of months ago, but nevertheless, the outlook for the German economy, an export-led model of global growth, is not terribly rosy for next year. And again, there are answers to this, and there are big questions and marks, as there are with the geopolitical positioning, about whether it wouldn't be healthy for Germany to move away from that heavily export-dependent, industrial manufacturing-based vision. And so whether this could be, in a sense, a positive impulse to make that move. But I think specifically in that area, with regard to economic policy, I would wonder whether, this to come back to Jutta's terrain, how my judgment on how healthy that conversation is would perhaps be a little more skeptical than your judgment on the question of public health. I think that
I'd like to stop it here and kick the ball back into Jutta's
Yeah.
before we then move on to the United States. But Jutta, you said so, like, also the intention, which was really dominated by the war in Ukraine, and there was a lot of solidarity. Also, I mean, I think this is important for our international audience to understand that Germany took in really thousands of refugees right away. So that was a huge accomplishment from the German society. But what Adam
it still is actually.
It still is, and but also from the very beginning on, it was a really quick reaction. But you talked about that the kind of very critical take on the COVID restrictions and the COVID policy, that was kind of dying out because the attention was very much like supporting Ukraine. But what Adam was stressing in his response is that, like, really on the end of those with lower incomes, they do suffer more now in December than they suffered in January or February. When it comes to energy prices, also like inflation, food prices, all that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So first of all, I mean, I did not talk about those geopolitical dimension at all, because this is when we look at surveys, not what the majority of Germans are very much concerned of. I mean, this is out of the view. This is why I did not hit this in my first answer. But I entirely agree that this is another dimension we have to really talk about. I also didn't want to imply that Germany is now a society with decreased inequality. This would be simply wrong to say this, but we started with an unequal society, and Corona already hit those which were at the lowest bottom most in terms of all possible dimensions. I mean, they did have less healthcare, they had to work in their works, they couldn't use home office and things like this. They got even more sick. I mean, it was just miserable. And they suffered really much more than other social strata from the lack of education for their children. And this we see in our data right now. Germany is doing miserably in competence scores, and very, very miserably in terms of psychological health, in particular of the young people. So I did not want to paint here wonderful color in terms of where we are coming from. Now this is and this is exactly what Adam just said. There is a lot of anxiety, and we all know that the energy crisis will hit in particular those strata of our society most. It will hit in particular the lowest 4 deciles of our households. It will particularly hit the low brothers and those popular and older people which can't move anymore and things like this. So we know all of this, and there's a lot of talk in politics that one wants to care for those people, but there is not this one solution. But I think that if we would have this conversation in January or in February, it would look much, much bleaker than now, because they are still, living in warm houses. They have enough energy. Prices, of course, increase, and lots of people don't have enough money and need to go to public sort of services for getting some nourishment. But it's not the social protest yet. This is probably up to come. We don't know that. And for this reason, I probably compare 2 things and comparing Apple and Pierce in a way. But yeah.
Don't you think it's interesting, Jutta, how, because you use protest in a really interesting way as an index, I was very struck when I was here, I think in September, how we had open talk from, amongst other people, Chancellor Scholz, about the possibility of Gilets jaunes style demonstrations over energy prices in Germany. It's really rather weird kind of political move for a major political figure to openly anticipate the possibility of disruptive protest.
Absolutely.
To publicly, almost socially, psychologically predict that as a feedback.
Annalena Baerbock, I mean, at the front of all of them. I mean, they told us that they are going to come. I mean, it was that dark pictures.
Extraordinary, really kind of
I was
almost.
looking, I'm living in the middle of Berlin, and I thought, well, where are they? Then I was traveling to East Germany, and of course they were more than here, but still we did not reach this public turmoil as we had it last year at all. Now, of course, we are talking about all those last generation people, much more than those poor people being hit by inflation and a recession.
I mean, it does feel to me as though we've been through, sort of starting with the Gilets jaunes moment, a kind of Europe-wide conversation, and also you might say learning process about how to deal with, you know, maybe in the very broadest sense, just transition issues, like, or just crisis management issues. And we saw in 2020, and I'm delighted that this panel highlights COVID the way it does, because if you look at something, the inflation problem, we were going to get an inflation problem, Putin's war or not, right? It doesn't reduce to Putin's war. The dislocation in the global economy, which we see in the United States as well as Europe, as though Putin's war impacts the United States barely at all, like, was going to produce social dislocation and inflation in 2022. We didn't see it coming. We didn't anticipate how strong it was. And of course, then in Europe, the war came on top. But in general, what I seem to see both in the previous coalition government and now with this government, a kind of scrambling effort to innovate mechanisms for stabilizing what, is Jutta quite rightly emphasized, is already an unequal social distribution, and to, as it were, contain the extraordinarily violent shocks to which it's being subject. And the combination of COVID 1 year and then 2 years later, this cost of living shock, this is as violent a switchback in terms of the terms of trade for ordinary working people, what they can buy for what they can earn, as we have seen in 50 years. It's really extraordinary. And this is happening under conditions which are radically changed from the 1970s, because organized labor, the countervailing forces that we used to count on in the kind of billiard ball mechanics of modern society, are not what they once were. Even in Germany, look at IG Metall's wage settlement this year. I mean, they accepted what is effectively a real wage cut. And this is the most powerful trade union in the world, arguably. I mean, it's certainly the most powerful trade union in Europe. There's not one to even remotely compare with the IG Metall in the United States. So it's really I think historians may look back at this phase as this period as a really fascinating, it has a kind of experimental feel to it. I think we're making things up as we go along. And to that extent, I have a lot of sympathy for the political leadership, both generations, who've had to deal with these shocks, because they are very unlike anything we've seen any time recently.
But Adam, one could also say, and this is a criticism regarding the German government, that like keeping the social peace comes with a high cost, which will be paid by the future generation. I mean, the debt. The debt, yeah. I'm not talking about the climate activists. I'm talking about the debt. I mean, I'm just, want to challenge you a little bit. I mean, there are millions, billions, we would say, in the United States paid to keep social peace, but it's not invested in any like future whatever.
Yeah,
I would say social peace is also protecting the future. But what do you make of that? Is the money well spent?
I mean, my polemical response would be, and this comment that you make, it's important to make it in a panel devoted to talking about Germany, because that comment is there. We're represented by, as we know, within the government by Lindner. And what I would polemically answer is, and so far, mercifully, it's done less damage than I expected it to do. Because it threatened to be an absolute blockade to what I regard as, and I think the vast majority of analysts and comparative studies would suggest most governments in the world are doing broadly similar things in response to these kind of shocks. Germany doesn't stand out within Europe as being particularly generous in this respect in trying to stabilize energy prices. What's really interesting, and I think this for me is the question about democratic culture, which Jutta started with, is how long we can go on in the kind of two-faced, Janus-faced, hypocritical kind of position where we pretend we're still doing debt brake politics and we still believe in the long-term sustainability of that vision of finance, when de facto we're just doing one Sonderfond after another. And I think what that does is to pose a different sort of problem for democracy, which is it's the sort of centrist version of post-factual populist politics, where you promise one thing, you promise people the high Welt in which you can get to sustainability and debt breaks. And we all actually know, and Lindner obviously knows because of what he does rather than what he says, that it's completely unsustainable. And the question for me is, what damage do we do? What poison do we introduce into a political culture where a major political party that pretends to the responsibility of government is not actually willing to say to its electorate, folks, wake up, smell the coffee. We're not in the 1990s anymore. The 3%, 60% rule in Europe won't work, and the debt brake won't work either, and for very good reason. And let me explain to you and take upon myself the responsibility of explaining to you why. And what's great, in a sense, in the German opinion polls is the voters don't appear to like it. They don't appear to like this hypocrisy. So that for me is part of, I would go with Jutta, like the decline in the FDP's support, I would read as a kind of healthy sign of a kind of coming to terms with these facts about the world. Because I regard them as realism. I don't regard them as like hypotheticals or adventurous progressivism. I regard this as nothing more than the dictates of reality in the current moment, because you cannot allow the social crisis to just burn itself out. You have to respond to these challenges. Germany needs to spend more on defense.
Let me first add a comment to Adam, and then answering your question with a question, actually, Ines. So comparing Lindner to Habeck is really fascinating in the moment, because Lindner, he sort of moves along saying, well, the Schuldenbremse is still here, and he knows, and I'm absolutely with Adam, he knows exactly that this is not telling the truth to people. And obviously, people don't want to hear the truth. Because compared to Habeck, who says, well, I know that I promised, a very, very different political strategy, and I have to move for reasons which, which are there, and which I'm not, sort of the person who I can only respond to what happened from outside. And he really, loses public support day by day, you could say, in the moment. So this having been said, Ines, what would be the alternative? If you're saying, well, we are pouring all this money, and probably we are pouring too much, it's not probably, most certainly we are pouring too much money to people who do not need this money. And no question about this. We do not have the right data to really target it to those people who need it. This is another question which sort of doesn't give a good picture for Germany.
But I think that's a very interesting
question. But
what is the money spent like, and you are the expert on that, is the money spent?
Much, I think it's much better, to spend money and to at least hold the entire, or try to hold the population together and try to move with most of the population along. And if you look at the support for the leftist party, this seems to work. The CDU, the Christian Democratic Party, gains voters, but they are not doing really an anti-politic to the government. This is here and there a little bit, but most of the measures they are supporting.
I want to bring in our audience. Please feel free to add your comments or ask questions. We have a chat function here in the Zoom, so join us. As you are very much on the same page, I have to be the disruptor here, I think, and I'm happily do so. No, answering your question, Jutta, is there a different way? The situation here in the United States is totally different. We are not hit here in the United States as hard at all as Germany is because of our energy dependency on Russia. Now I'm talking about Germany. So the situation is different. But what Joe Biden and Buttigieg did, they invested money in the future, in projects, with this big $360 billion program Investitionsprogramm, Infrastrukturplan, infrastructure plan. Would something like that be helpful in Germany as well, to really invest specifically in green infrastructure and also in education?
Well, in education, in traffic, I mean, you know about our train system. I mean, of course, investments are heavily needed. No question about that. But then there's Mr. Lindner saying, well, I can't do this and I can't do this as well. And it's not just, investing in things. It's also investing in an equal society, in a less gendered society. And this is why we do not get this tax splitting for married couple away and things like this, because, I mean, it's sort of costing. I mean, actually, it would save him a lot of money, but it's the front end cost. So it really hinders not just investments, but also reforms which were promised by the coalition treaty last year.
I mean, I have to say that one of the real surprises about visiting, I haven't been here since September, has been the sudden surge in interest in the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was done, the deal was done in July. And somehow the initial response of Europe was, yay, the Americans are finally doing climate politics. And something odd seems to have happened between now, since then and now, in which all of a sudden what the Europeans have decided the Americans have done is to create this huge challenge to European industrial policy. And the Americans are taking loads of money in their hands and spending it. And Europe needs to do something. And it's crazy. I mean, it's really an astonishingly distorted image of reality. It's amazing kind of Hall of Mirrors effect. I mean, by any reasonable measure, Europe right now is spending, in terms of investment and subsidy on green energy transformation, more than 2 times as a share of GDP what the United States is proposing to spend. This is Daniel Gross's figure, I believe, maybe on the basis of Royal calculations. So this idea that somehow America has sort of chosen to act and is doing so on a large scale, and the Europeans have some catching up to do is counterfactual. I mean, it's so, which raises the question of why the Europeans are choosing to interpret it this way, which I think has good explanations. I'll come to those in just a second. Another counterfactual element of this is that the Europeans describe this as this bold action by the United States, which demonstrates the capacities of the American state to act quickly and in a determined way. And so Europe needs something similar, an woe is us, we're clearly incapable of this. Now, again, as a description of how the Inflation Reduction Act came together, this is completely counterfactual. The Inflation Reduction Act is surely best read as a symptom of the ongoing and profound crisis of governance in the United States, whereby this kind of thing somehow emerges from a crazy, crazy process, which on the 14th of July looked dead, and the following morning, because Schumer and Manchin bumped into each other in the corridors of the Senate, and Schumer's staffers were visibly their eyes were tearing up, and suddenly some sort of deal emerged. The third bizarre thing is that the European political commentators read this as government policy, Biden administration policy, whereas, of course, the fact of the matter is the process was so embarrassing that Schumer's people put a firewall between what was going on in Congress and Biden, because when Biden had tried to strong-arm Manchin earlier in the year, it had been an embarrassing failure. So what, to me, this reads as a sort of reflection of European neuroses in the mirror, this distorting mirror of what they take to be American politics.
Where does this come from, Adam? Where does this come from?
So I think fundamentally, I think the positive way of reading this is a kind of the Van der Middelaar kind of way of reading this, which is that Europe's politics is growing up. They've discovered the hard truth that political organization and energy probably requires enemies. You have Putin as an enemy, and now the Americans have given you another enemy in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bit ambiguous because it's a little bit unheimlich to be making the Americans into a boogeyman. But after all, Merkel positioned this in May 27 with the Munich speech. And so in a sense, that is the wisdom of the current moment. And I regard it as real wisdom, because do not trust the Americans any further that you can throw them on any of these issues. This is an entirely internal American political process. You can bet as much money as you like on the fact that the archive will reveal that at no point in the designing of the Inflation Reduction Act did any serious American politician consider either its WTO conformity or its implications for South Korea or Europe. It was just not part of the calculation. right? So whereas the Europeans look at it and go, oh my God, we're going to have to rethink the entire basis for state subsidy rules within the EU. And this is going to be a fundamental question. And I gather within the economics ministry, there was a huge debate between the WTO Abteilung, the people who do Handelspolitik, and the people who do climate policy. And like none of this ever happened on the American side. It was just teams of staffers trying to get some kind of deal done. So what this tells us, I think, is that Europe is looking for mechanisms to energize itself. It's discovered the energizing function of such mechanisms. COVID worked really well because you didn't argue with each other. You just treated the pandemic as an external threat which no one was responsible for, so you acted. Putin works in the same way, and now the Inflation Reduction Act is doing the same sort of thing. And what it's giving you is the cause to talk about sovereignty, industrial policy, interventionism, loosening rules in Brussels that are incredibly cumbersome. They've been trying to have a conversation, goes back to Altmaier, right? A conversation about industrial policy, and now they can finally do it out in the open because the Americans have gone there. The only really serious issue here is technological. Like, does it matter whether you're early on the learning curves for batteries? That's where, but it's super technical and it's difficult to arbitrate if you're not actually in the industry. It's a staggering, if you go back and forth between the two political cultures, it's staggeringly disparate currently. And the dysfunctional element of this is that insofar as Germany has people not just, forget friendly, interested in European affairs in Washington right now, and that's a limited group of people, for them, the kind of uproar in Europe right now, and particularly the indignation that's been generated quite suddenly on the European side, not months ago, but now all of a sudden, is hugely dysfunctional. If you speak to the outriders of the Biden team, and they talk to people like us, they will just say, well, Adam, can you get these people to shut up? Don't you understand that this is grist to the mill of Europe's enemies? And what we really need here is some sort of live and let live between the two sides in which we basically agree to do non-WTO conforming stuff whilst we get the energy transition going, because what we've done in the Inflation Reduction Act is as good as it's ever going to get from the Americans.
How did, in that regard, the state visit of President Emmanuel Macron work out here? I mean, this was one attempt, beautiful state dinner. I would have loved to attend. Man,
that's a fancy dinner, wasn't it?
Doesn't this look nice? That was obviously one reason. I mean, it was planned longer on because of the subs and everything, but I think at this very moment, it was obviously also meant to calm this news. Big German magazine, Der Spiegel, already called it a Wirtschaftskrieg. So did it calm it down a little bit? What do you make of it?
I think people saw what the constructive thing that came out of that was that the American legal mind got going, and a bunch of very smart people in the administration who now have to deal with this turkey, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, and actually make something out of it. Said, you know what? If we just reread this free trade agreement thingy in a way that implies that people who are allies, who maybe this wording could be taken to imply that X, Y, Z, and so maybe we can take this off the table after all. And that isn't really even a terrible distortion of anything anyone was thinking in the summer, because no one in the summer was actually thinking anything serious. Other than that, we need wording in here which signals that this is a Buy America program and that it's an exclude China program. Those were the two things that matter. The other deep misunderstanding on the German and European side is we think the car industry, Europeans do, is like national prizes. Whereas, of course, the days of that in the United States are long gone. GM went bust in 2009. Ford is now a third tier player. Really what we're talking about there is the internal politics of where other people build car factories in the United States, including German firms. I mean, the biggest car exporter from the United States is BMW, the SUV part in Spartanburg. So I think there's huge amounts of flexibility here once we get past the matters of principle. But if the lawyers in the German administration and Europe turn this into an issue of WTO compatibility, we're done for. If you open up this space of what we actually kind of meant by a free trade deal was anyone we really fancied to friendshaw with, the space for movement.
We also, I think, have to remind ourselves that it was Germany who was against TTIP. I mean, also just as a little side effect. Adam, maybe you can talk a little bit about the situation in the United States and how it has changed with COVID, especially when it comes to the socio-economic discussion or situation.
I mean, the simple on the COVID story for 2022 is that the pandemic ended, right? That is the and I didn't say that. I put that in Anführungszeichen, in scare quotes, right? I mean, because the pandemic is about to enter a massive new stage in China. We now have a completely uncontrolled epidemic that is going to infect 500 million people in the next 2 to 3 weeks, maybe, the rate it's going in China right now. So we are so not done with this. And it's quite possible this will blow back hard next year. But 2022, as far as the US was concerned, anyone on this call living in the US will attest, you had your 4th shot, your 5th shot, and life moved on in a really very dramatic way. And the American hard policy, very unlike the sort of social compromises that Jutta studies in Germany, the hard American labor market model, where basically people lose their jobs and then people get hired back into their jobs, has an upside. I mean, it's hugely disruptive. It creates massive uncertainty, huge stress, social psychological stress for the people who go through this roller coaster. But the upside is when they go back into the labor market, they have more bargaining power than their European equivalents because the employers actually have to hire them back. And so we have seen much greater wage growth in the United States this year than we have seen in Europe. Still not enough to keep up with inflation, but relatively better at the bottom end of the American labor market. And that's part of this hugely dynamic and unstable American labor market story, which is totally unlike the new short-time working model in Europe. Whereas one of the questions you hear being discussed in the German economics ministry right now is how long can we really go on with this short-time working thing? At some point, we're going to have to actually just shove people out of the, this new comfortable environments that have been creating. Very hard Darwinian talk about the need for adjustment, structural adjustment, reconcile, accepting that losses are losses. But in America, Biden captured a reality when he said the pandemic's over. As a matter of public discourse, it really has just collapsed. It's dropped down the salience levels. I mean, it's just not terribly salient anymore. And that may come back to kick us in the butt mightily next year if we have some nasty new variant that comes out of China. But fingers crossed, the assumption is it's done and the vaccines are a triumph, right? That's the basic story. And you then bury the fact that 1 million people died. And you bury the fact that as recently as the beginning of this year, 2,000 people were dying a day in the United States. But memories are short. You move on.
I mean, what we experience here in the United States is really a labor shortage, right? I mean, you can't go anywhere without seeing signs everywhere, looking for workers. Like, where does this come from? Explain that to us, Adam.
Massive demand. I mean, the demand stimulus is there. They did the Keynesian thing, this 2021 stimulus, and that's what creates the concomitant of that is, of course, the concern about inflation, which has spilled over to the entire transatlantic system. And means the Fed is now balancing that problem. The ECB wishes it had the Fed's problem. The ECB wishes it had a really strong European economy, which it could then, as it were, pull the leashes on, the Zügel anziehen. It could actually just sort of coax the. As far as Germany is concerned, the situation is more analogous to the United States than most parts of Europe. The German labor market is also pretty hot. There is acute shortage of labor in lots and lots of areas. And that changes the debate about migration, which we're seeing. Again, the economics ministry is proposing an incredibly liberal, economistic, points-based migration system. For Europe as a whole, it's much more problematic, of course, because the unevenness of inflation across the giant European economy is huge. But Germany is a kind of pretty decent analog to the American situation with correspondingly high inflation as well, right? Over 10% for a while there.
Any part for different reasons.
Nodding heavily. Yeah, maybe I pass it.
Any part for different reasons, because what we envision much more than the US is, of course, the demographic change with the baby boomers now entering retirement. So I'm not concerned about increasing unemployment because there's really a shortage. What we need is to retrain our workers and employees, which we are not used to. I mean, compared to the US, we still have this very orderly life course with one education, one training at the front of the career trajectory, and then the best of all worlds is one job for the entire life, and then the retirement. And this changes right now tremendously. And there's a lot which the National Unemployment Agency and Hubertus Heil brings forward to say, well, we have paid leave of absence if you re-enter vocational training and things like this. So there are a lot of changes underneath probably from the outside supposed orderly and quietness in Germany.
And do you see that also feeding then into the energy transition that presumably is a big opportunity then, right? To create a kind of very constructive mobility also within the ranks of what the Americans would call the blue collar workforce.
Yeah, I studied this in particular, and I have data from 500,000 people working in the industrial IG Metall, and they really thought, well, I do not need to train or be retrained for any job in the energy sector. I can keep on my job, and this entirely changed. So the new data of this year, they are all open for the training and things like this, that they know exactly that they can't stay in their job. So they are open for transitions, which is a very, very good first step, because it finds acceptance for change. And Germans are not really people who like change at all.
I mean,
what we're just having in Germany right now as well is a debate about retirement age, right? I mean, Olaf Scholz, our chancellor, just said that he wants people to work longer and comparatively to other European countries. So maybe Jutta, you can talk a little bit about that.
No. I don't think that he said. I did not read it like this, and he didn't mean it, at least. I think that he probably did not put it very well. I would have done this a little bit differently. What is true, and which also hits our pensions, is that we have a huge amount of people who retire way before the age of 67, which is our retirement age. So they retire at age 60, 61, in particular people being in the care economy, because they most certainly can't work for their entire life in these very, very demanding jobs. So this means that we have to have more people working until the age of 62, 63 and stop pre-retirement. But we do not have a discussion in the moment to increase our retirement age.
But then I was kind of not clear enough. That's not what he said, but he said that he wants people to work up to 67 years.
Yeah, but this is
pretty old if you have like a blue collar job, no?
Yeah, but this goes hand in hand with what I just mentioned, that we, for the first time in the history of Germany, have incentives to interrupt your labor force career for going back into education. And this is also, a way in saying, well, I mean, you are now in your job, you think your job is safe, you are doing fine, you earn your money, but wait, this job will disappear, and better prepare now. And this is what we think since years, actually, that this needs to be done. They were pretty slow, but now they are coming up, and the floor is open for them, and the acceptance is increasing, as I just said. So we have to see those two measures together. I mean, trying to work longer, but not in the job you have been trained first in, but in a second or even third job, which is the most normal thing in other societies, but not in Germany.
Mm-hmm. Adam, you want to add something to that?
Well, I was thinking about the EV transition, which is a really dramatic. I mean, Jutta was talking about talking to these people in IG Metall, and I do think 2022 will be remembered perhaps as the year where the end of the internal combustion engine, a truly epic historical transition, finally became real. It's absolutely real. It's undeniable. It's happening. You cannot, if you're in the business of metalworking and engineering, mechanical engineering in Germany, deny the fact the internal combustion and all the ancillaries, the gearbox, all of that stuff, which is so demanding, is going the way of the dinosaur, and it's going the way of the dinosaur really rapidly. I mean, over the next 10 years, it'll essentially end. And I think that there are these moments of the fact that we can anticipate this as clearly as we can is historically remarkable. But a bit like with pandemics, there's a difference between generally anticipating that fact and finally realizing, oh, damn, we're actually in a lockdown. My life is fundamentally different. And so therefore I have to act and adjust myself and do things differently. And what the data that Jutta's referring to seem to suggest is that that moment of realization has arrived. And I think that in and of itself is a really profound shift, to go from the general idea, yes, of course, cars are going to end, to, well, in that case, I should probably retrain as a technician for XYZ is a big, major break, and shouldn't be trivialized. I mean, it's easy from the outside to kind of poke fun in a sense at the German obsession with mechanical engineering, and but it's nevertheless for millions of people in one of the most prestigious, most high status, blue collar lines of work there's ever been, full stop, anywhere in the world. To make that transition is a historical demarcation. It's really very important, because it's going to come out much shrunken, right? It's not going to be the same thing with the EV.
The word Zeitenwende is really kind of true for so many levels in Germany. Do we have something like a Zeitenwende as well here in the United States, Adam?
We've had several. I think the Americans have been preoccupied with their national Zeitenwende for they can't decide between arcs of history and Zeitenwende, or American carnage. The American capacity to project their own national history into grand historical arcs for a historian or somebody interested in the philosophy of history in particular is a gefundenes Fressen, or a Freude, as the Germans might say. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. So for somebody like Scholz, of all politicians, to rise to the level of saying, there is this historical pivot happening, it is remarkable. No, I think America is caught, and this should not be underestimated, and it is enduring and it's ongoing. And Merkel, God bless her, was the first German politician to say, this is a break, and this is to the extent to which Scholz's Zeitenwende talk is belated or just unrealistic. I mean, if there has been a Zeitenwende, it happened in the Crimea in 2014, or it happened in 2008, or it happened in 2017. It didn't happen in 2022, right? And certainly America is profoundly preoccupied with that question. I mean, it's both a domestic question, and above all, it's a global question. And from the European point of view, it's essential to understand that the external driver is China, China, China. And you just simply can't say it enough. Like, nothing else registers, including with regard to strategy in Ukraine. And it's crucial for Europeans to understand the extent to which it's that double preoccupation with internal American problems and the external threat of China in the Pacific, that if you want to do business with America and you want to have some sense of predictability of American decision making, you need to anchor it on those two things. What is your domestic situation like, and how are you thinking about China?
Jutta, do you agree that the Zeitenwende is older than Olaf Scholz's chancellery?
Sure, but in terms of the realization of that Zeitenwende, I would come to a different conclusion. But I think that Adam is with me, because if I look how people think about it, it really arrived now. It was not Merkel, it was not 2015 and things like this. They realize it now. They realized it with COVID. They realized it with the war in Ukraine. They realized it with the rise of independence of energy from other markets. It's now that the realization comes to the ordinary people, and therefore they, sort of start moving, which they were so reluctant to do before.
Maybe both of you can.
It was probably, it was for Merkel. She tried and tried, but she couldn't really get the people together, and she couldn't bring it to the minds of the people on the street. Only to the intellectual minds, and this now happened by all those awful incidents.
I want to bring in some viewers, and I think that's a valid point. Robert Altschuler is talking about the Reichsbürger. He asks, how have the average German citizens reacted to the coup attempt against their government? Jutta, do you want to take this question?
Well, it increases. I mean, we have data which show that it increases the trust in politics and our security system. That they really, walked and preventively in a way and caught them. So this is what we see. So it had rather an effect that people felt well governed.
How did you react, Adam, when you heard about that? And do you think it's fair to draw similarities to January 6th, to this January 6th attempt here in Washington, in the United States?
No, I don't. I mean, I think they are both, truly like farcical events. And I'm not a January. I don't. My American friends tell me I don't take January 6th seriously enough. But this was even less serious than January 6th, clearly. I mean, it was truly farcical. The the dimension of this, which I think is really important, and I'd love to hear Jutta's view on this, is that it seems that really since 2015, and this was exposed by a variety of different investigative and journalists' attempts to really reconstruct what went on during the refugee crisis of 2015, and was then surfaced a little bit during the Chemnitz, controversies. Like, there is, I think, a serious question about the degree to which the security organs of the German state, the intelligence services, the specialists, these Spezialeinheiten, the special, Germany doesn't really have special forces, but those kind of units with a kind of elite kind of conception of themselves as guardians, as a state within the state and so on, the extent to which they are prey to social media produced phenomena of like the balkanization of political culture, such that they imagine themselves in a different world in which they have to protect Germany or their vision of Germany from bad things happening. And the most interesting conversations I've heard about the event are really go to this question, like how serious a matter is it that in the Bundeswehr, in the veteran organizations, in the Spezialeinheiten, in the police, under Merkel, we believe in the intelligence services, right? There was a rupture of confidence between self-appointed guardians of the German state and its national interest in those zones and mainstream politics, implausibly between them and Angela Merkel of all people. And that, I think, I don't believe it's, indicative of the real risk of a coup. I mean, I think that's laughable, but it certainly points to quite how profoundly this shift, which I would agree with Jutta on, like I think German politics is moving hard and it's moving in interesting ways. There are people who are left behind, not just in social terms, but are left behind in ideological terms. And some of those people are in those kind of organs of the state. And that's important if it's the case. I mean, I know it in monetary policy, because that's where the AfD came from, anti-Draghi protests. That's where the AfD was originally based. And they run these cases in the Verfassungsgericht, and they try and challenge the ECB on what most of us think is a central policy. But I worry that there are, as it were, these kind of groups holding out across what you might call the deep state in the American sense.
Jutta.
Well, I think that we don't know yet. You know that we all look down to the Bundeswehr. We all think that they are doing a lousy job. They're entirely corrupted and things like this. We also look down at our military and things like that. But in this case, and the question was about the Reichsbürger, most people had, at least surveys tell us, had a positive impression. So that the intelligence service really was behind this scene of 20,000 people months ahead and did a pretty good job. So this part I would set separate from change in opinion about the Bundeswehr or the police yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We're slowly coming to an end. As we are so close to Christmas, I would like to end on a positive note. Also, as we started with a positive note, Adam, what can we hope for when it comes to next year?
I was a little struck by Jutta's point that she thought that the Greens had abandoned their agenda in this year. I don't think
that they no, I did not say that they abandoned it.
Oh, okay.
I think that they're forced to work against their own policy. I mean, they had to find
compromises. Probably that's what you probably meant.
Compromises. But what I'm impressed by, I maybe just be too close to these people because they're kind of my political friends. But nevertheless, what I'm impressed by, in fact, I know for a fact that there is a roadmap of the implementation of structural change and energy transition being mapped out in ministries in Berlin, which brings Germany back to the fore of that kind of movement next year and in years going forward. And that is the kind of strategic vision that we need. And if it's not in Berlin right now, it's nowhere in the world, to be absolutely blunt. Maybe in Beijing in their own authoritarian version of it, but nowhere else. Nowhere in the democratic world is there the same prospect. And I think not just of this government, but if you think about the coalition calculus of German politics, it's very difficult to imagine any government without the Greens. And this means that I think the logic of the energy transition is gathering momentum, and I expect to see that accelerating next year. With or without money, I don't mean money would really help, and it would be great if Lindner would step aside or do another one of his fudges. But I think the technological, the industrial policy momentum is there now, and I think we're really, we may have passed the tipping point, which is very dramatic. And I was fascinated to hear Jutta's data there about the IG Metall data, because I'm somebody who tends to think of things very much from the top down and in macro terms, and one's painfully aware of the fact that you don't grasp the sea change, if you like, in broader social terms. And if samples of 500,000 IG Metall members are showing this kind of shift in their understanding of their own trajectories and their biographies, well, that's as important a historical break as any that we're likely to see. And so that, I think, that's one of the more optimistic things I've heard out of this year is, wow, that's a big deal if that is happening and if that gathers momentum.
Thank you, Adam. Jutta, the last words are yours.
Well, in terms of some optimistic notes, I think that the basic income, if you want to put it like this, for children will come at the end of 2023 or the start of 2024. And this will be a big move forward, bigger than the transition from Hartz IV to the Bürgergeld, which was transformed at the very end to something which I didn't want to see. I thought it's really moving much more to a basic income, but now, given that the sanctions continue, it did not hit this goal. And I also think that the basic protection law, democratic protection law, which just today came into this will help. It's a lot of money which we are going to spend for that. And I much hope that the government will find more targeted measures for the need for those people who need help coming not just through the winter, but helping them to really get along with the energy transformation, which we all need desperately.
Jutta Allmendinger, thank you so much, Adam Tooze. It was fascinating. I think our audience learned a lot. Everything is connected with everything. That's always true. But I really liked in this discussion to point out also the positive things which came out of this very, very difficult year. And we definitely must not forget those people who are kind of really obviously in Ukraine, also in definitely also some people living in Russia in very, very difficult, heartbreaking situations. And our thoughts definitely go out to them as well, because I think we can't discuss this year, 2022, without thinking about the victims of this horrible war. I thank the American Council on Germany and 1014 to organize that. And I hope we all see each other soon again. And I wish you happy holidays. Thank you very
much, Ines, for this wonderful moderation. And thank you, Katja, for the invitation. And thanks, Adam, for your wonderful insights. I love to read your notes daily. I mean, this is just great, your chart book.
Thank you all.
It's been an absolute pleasure as always. Yeah.
Bye-bye.